Okay, I wanted to talk specifically about New York and what we're doing, but I'm going to do it from my perspective in working on methane and methane emissions from shale gas. So let me jump right into that. Uh, 11 years ago, Tony Ingraffia and Renee Santoro and I published a paper. It's really the first paper looking at methane emissions from shale gas development, from high volume hydraulic fracturing. And at this point, the shale gas revolution had really taken off 2008 or 9. We started thinking about this in 2009, 10. It took us till spring of 2011 to publish the paper, but it's the very first paper looking at methane from this. And we did it in the context of the natural gas as a bridge fuel. And particularly, we were worried about shale gas at that time because, shale gas is now over 75% of U.S. natural gas production, and most of the natural gas growth in consumption globally has been U.S. shale gas over the last decade. And we it turned out that's a much faster growth rate than I expected, but we knew it was going to be a big thing, and we were worried about this idea that somehow it was okay to use this as a replacement for coal. So this is from our paper. We actually presented both a 100-year and a 20-year time frame, but we favored the 20-year time frame, and other people had done that before. Catherine Hayhoe had actually strongly suggested using a 20-year time frame as well, and I was influenced by that. I won't go through this in any detail except to point out that we're looking here at shale gas, conventional natural gas, coal, and oil in terms of their greenhouse gas footprint, looking both at direct CO2 emissions, which are the blue, indirect CO2 emissions are in red, and then methane converted to CO2 equivalencies in that magenta color. And the data available to us, particularly for shale gas, was very, very limited, pretty limited for conventional natural gas too. There really was not a lot of work going on in this area at the time. And we used mostly unpublished EPA data, a lot of unpublished data from industry. Very interestingly, we started giving talks on this preliminary work in 2009, 2010, and we got a lot of input from people in industry who leaked us data saying it was worse than we had thought. And we used those leaked data if we could verify them. Renee Santoro, who's the second author here, was a fact checker for the Washington Post for a while. So her role was to verify data for us before we used it. But that's where a lot of our information was from. It's pretty poorly documented, let me phrase it that way. But our conclusion was that it looked bad, and because of the methane emissions, the greenhouse gas footprint, particularly of shale gas, but conventional gas as well, might be as bad or worse than coal, but that there's a need for much better measurements by independent scientists. And just as an aside, if I forget, NPR Frontline series, I don't know if you've watched it, but last night and a week ago had the first and two-part series on how the oil and gas industry has tried to shape the arguments about oil and climate change over time. Very, very nice pieces, I think, so far. The third and final part of that series is next Tuesday, and it's specifically on the idea of methane emissions from shale gas influence the greenhouse gas footprint and industry's efforts to try and distort that. So you might be interested in it. I think I'll be on it. The day our paper came out, this appeared in the New York Times, and I think it did a pretty good job of capturing it. The middle paragraph there says that, at the very least, we ought to be making better measurements. We really were not trying to be too dogmatic in what we said. But we were trying to undercut this idea that natural gas and shale gas could be a bridge fuel because of the methane emissions. And we got a huge amount of industry pushback on that. We also got a lot of press. It was picked up in well over 1,000 newspapers. And Tony and I were named as runners-up for Time Magazine People of the Year in that year because of the newsworthiness of this. And I think it did help undercut the idea of natural gas as a bridge fuel. Jumping ahead, this figure is from a paper that Mark Jacobson and I just published last August. And, more than 11 years after our paper came out, there are now hundreds of papers on peer-reviewed papers on methane emissions from shale gas and natural gas as a driver of climate change. Our paper alone has been cited in over 1,700 peer-reviewed papers. So there's been a huge amount. And what we've tried to do here in this figure is to capture the very, very latest data. So I'm quite confident in these numbers. It's still using a 20-year global warming potential. Again, the direct CO2 emissions are in yellow now. Methane converted to CO2 equivalencies is in red. Natural gas footprint is as large as coal, perhaps larger. The arrow there is actually not in our paper. I've added it more recently because more recent data, paper by Sargent et al. Suggests that methane emissions from the delivery system, at least in Boston, are higher than we'd estimate by a fair amount. So that arrow reflects their input. Bottom line, I would have thought that the bridge fuel idea was completely dead, except that I heard John Kerry speaking just a day or so ago, and he's speaking again about the fact that natural gas is a bridge fuel, and we need to. He's putting it in the Ukrainian context, but he's using that exact language, which is very frustrating. If any of you know John, see if you can get through to him. I was pleased to be invited to give a briefing in the White House on our work on methane at the end of the Obama administration. And I was asked to speak specifically on what we should be doing to reduce methane emissions from natural gas. And this was when they were coming forward with their methane regulations, and I was asked to comment on it and all. And I was never a big supporter of the Obama suggestions for methane regulations, in part because I didn't think there was any way to independently verify them. So what I told the president's science advisor was that I really thought what we should be doing is just not using natural gas, getting rid of it as quickly as possible. And sure, there are things we could do to prohibit flaring and venting, et cetera, but we needed independent verification, which at the time was difficult. It's easier now with satellite data. And there was no provision in that in the Obama methane rules, which made me skeptical. I also was not and am not a big fan of putting a lot of effort into fixing leaks in our urban delivery systems, because I think we ought to be simply tearing those systems up and putting our resources into replacing the gas with renewable energy instead. So and that's where I want to be going now. Starting pretty soon after our paper came out in 2011, I started to think about where we should be moving. I was heavily influenced by Mark Jacobson's work. Mark's at Stanford, as you probably know. And Mark and I and others published this paper in February of 2013, which lay out a blueprint for moving the state of New York to a fossil fuel-free future fairly quickly. And in terms of intellectual content, this paper is 99% Mark Jacobson's. I'm the second author on it because I convinced Mark to write a paper about New York, and I know something about New York and help put a New York focus on it. But it's really Mark's work. He'd been working extensively on these sorts of ideas for quite some time, gave a talk at Cornell, but hadn't yet put it into a geographic specificity. And I suggested he start with New York, which he did, which is the genesis of this paper. Why New York? Well, if you deconvolute the United States and into each state as an independent economy, California, Texas, and New York dominate this national economy, right? New York's the 10th largest economy in the world. We're on a par with France. And so, what we do here matters, both physically and as an example. And we were on the verge at that point in time of banning high volume hydraulic fracturing in New York, banning shale gas now, and we did. But that meant we had an enlightened political situation in which to suggest alternatives. Unfortunately, in the time since we banned it, natural gas use in New York has grown faster than any other state, and it's all fracked shale gas, mostly from Pennsylvania. So we're huge users, but we're not producers. And we were trying to lay out in 2013 an alternative. So this is the plan. And again, it was paper came out in 2013. So keep that in mind when you look at the scaling here. But the top line there is what we projected energy demand in New York would be, absent any change. The next line down here is energy demand simply by going to beneficial electrification for transportation and heating. The efficiencies are so much greater that you don't need as much energy. We found ways to increase energy efficiencies beyond that, taking this down to our actual energy need, and we're taking out fossil fuels and growing in principally with wind and solar. That's the plan. And we said we should do this with 100% renewable electricity, solar, wind, hydro. You need some storage of electricity, and we looked at that in detail. By the way, everything in the plan said it could be done with technologies available as of the time, 8 years ago. It's easier now, it's cheaper now. We said we could do it with no fossil fuels and no nuclear power. And again, it's based on beneficial electrification of transportation, electric vehicles, and beneficial electrification of heating, high efficiency heat pumps. And I took this to heart in my personal life. This is my home. There's no snow on it today, but there was yesterday. So it's not an inaccurate picture. We used to heat with oil, and we converted 8 years ago to a geothermal source. All of our electricity is renewable. We drive, one of our 2 cars is an electric car. We've been doing that for quite a while. So we have a low emissions footprint. Now, the Jacobson et al. Paper from 2013 actually has made some difference. Mark and I wrote a separate paper later for California, but Mark's gone on and written a plan for every single state and most countries in the world through the Solution Project now. And if you haven't seen it, please take a look. I will tell you that our paper also provided some of the intellectual underpinnings for the Green New Deal, and particularly Ed Markey and AOC. And to Biden's Build It Back Better plan, which of course hasn't gone anywhere, but AOC in particular was taken by our plan. She of course is from New York and was well familiar with our plan, and I and others have briefed her on it. And directly, our plan led to this New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019. And actually, the bill passed our state assembly way back in 2015, but it never got traction in the Senate until we had a Democratic majority in our Senate finally in 2019. But it's now the law, and much of it does flow directly from our paper. So the law mandates that we look at methane differently than any other state. I'll get to that in a minute. Calls for 40% reduction in all greenhouse gas emissions, all sectors of our economy by 2030, 85% by 2050, and we're moving to renewable electricity pretty quickly, 100% carbon free by 2040. It also has a high environmental justice component, which is very seriously part of the law. These goals are all mandatory, they're binding, but it doesn't, the law doesn't say precisely how to get there. And what it did was to set up this group called the Climate Action Council, basically a commission. I'm one of the 22 people who's on it. Most of the people on it are leaders in government, our commissioners of labor, our commissioners of transportation, et cetera, et cetera. And this is just a picture of us taken 2 weeks ago yesterday. We have a plan and it's up for public hearings, and this was one of our public hearings. So I say 2 weeks ago yesterday. So a bit on the methane accounting. And there are 2 aspects to it that are novel. One is that we take responsibility for methane emissions associated with the use, says natural gas, but any fossil fuel, no matter where the emissions occur. And that's written deliberately because, as I say, we banned fracking in New York State, and yet we are using more and more fracked gas from Pennsylvania and Ohio and West Virginia. Methane emissions there are quite large, but they occur there, mostly not in New York. And so they weren't showing up in our greenhouse gas inventory. And the law says, we said, we should take responsibility for those emissions because we're causing it by our use of the gas. And then it also specifies a use of a 20-year time period as opposed to a 100-year time period for calculating the CO2 equivalency. And that's because the 100-year equivalency clearly understates the damage done by methane, and the IPCC has gotten more and more clear about that. Whether or not 20 years is the right time frame, I think is open to debate. And Rob Jackson and his colleagues have suggested a little bit longer, but I think the 20 years is what we went with in New York, and I think it's the right ballpark. So I published a paper in the summer of 2020 as to what this change in greenhouse gas accounting might look like for New York. And this is what I came up with. On the left is what the New York greenhouse gas inventory for fossil fuel use looks like under the old inventory approach. And on the right is what it's would look like under our new law. And it's color coded. So natural gas is in red, petroleum is blue, and coal's in black. We don't have a lot of coal in the state. And the darker colors are all CO2 emissions, and the lighter shades are methane emissions in terms of equivalency. So, if you look at the left, well, transportation is our biggest thing, and that's where you'd really hone in. Residences or electricity are close seconds. But when you look at the right under the new, and you can see actually methane's included in the left, but you can see how trivial those things are. It's just under the old accounting, methane disappears into the woodwork. In the new accounting, and this is principally because we're taking the out-of-state emissions into context, methane becomes quite dominant, in fact, and residential and commercial uses become the #1 greenhouse gas emitter, and that changes how you think about it as a policy matter. And that's really caught the attention of state officials. This is from just last week, a reporter for Politico. And as she says, changing the way planet warming gases are accounted for may sound like a yawn. I've always thought it was pretty exciting, but apparently not everyone thought so. But it actually has changed how the state views it. So we've honed in on what we need to do to get gas out of our homes, which would never have been the focus under the old accounting. And it's to reduce methane. So using the new accounting, this is the percentages of our total greenhouse gas emissions for a year or so ago, coming by various sectors. Buildings are by far the biggest sector, followed by transportation. And then electricity waste is almost up there with electricity, and that's because of methane. Others are much smaller. And just to put it in a methane specific, it says at the bottom here, methane equals 37% of our total greenhouse gas inventory with this accounting system. And fossil fuels is the biggest source of that, with residential buildings and all, but wastes are important. And these are the 4 largest things to hone in on if you really want to reduce methane. And on our State Climate Action Council, we are honing in on reducing these specifically. So let me tell you what the plan is. That by law, we had to write a draft implementation plan to meet the Climate Act goals. Had to be out by December, a few months ago, and we did that. We had a hell of a lot of debate and discussion, but in the end, we passed it unanimously. It's out for public hearings for a while, and we're supposed to approve a final plan by the end of this year. So this shows total greenhouse gas emissions over time from 2020. The black triangles are the mandated goals we need to meet. We'd be up at this upper line. Emissions would be going down even if the state did nothing, simply, electric vehicles and other efficiency gains. But we need to do much more. And we're looking specifically at 2 scenarios which will meet these targets with real implementation plans behind them. So I won't go into detail of the implementation plans, but this is our total energy use by fuel type for just, again, 2 different scenarios. They look about the same. We're going to increase green electricity from solar, wind, and hydro pretty quickly. We're going to get rid of natural gas, gasoline. Top one has a bigger role for hydrogen than the bottom one does, but that's 100% green hydrogen from renewable electricity, no fossil hydrogen whatsoever. So these are what our plans are calling for. We're debating how much hydrogen we want. That's the difference between these 2 scenarios. And in order to get there, for buildings, which is our biggest emission source, we're calling for a prohibition on the use of gas and other fossil fuels in new home construction by 2024, about 20 months from now. And in large, all commercial buildings and large residential buildings by 2027. By 2030 to 2035, if you have an older house and your gas furnace or your gas stove dies, we would prohibit it from being replaced in kind. You'd have to go beneficial electrification at that time. And of course, we want to do so before then. So we're also proposing an aggressive retrofitting of heating and other fossil fuel appliances in homes starting this year. And finishing with 2 million homes within the next 7.5 years. We have 6 million single family homes currently heated with fossil fuels in New York. 4.5 million of those are natural gas, and we're moving hard to get rid of those. And we want to dismantle the gas distribution system rather than fixing the leaks in it, get rid of it as we replace gas. In terms of building energy demand, it's shown on the top here. And again, the electricity use will go up. Natural gas will disappear as a heating source. And you can see at the bottom that the reduction in space heating emissions is the biggest change there. A little bit on electricity. This is a busy slide, but we're looking from 2020 to 2050. We have 4 nuclear power plants in New York that we are calling for keeping open through 2045 and then phasing out 2 of them in 2050, but no new nuclear construction. This is the natural gas and a little bit of oil, but mostly natural gas component. We're calling for completely phasing that out by 2040 and replacing it largely with solar and offshore wind, a little bit more hydro. And these plans are being implemented. We actually have the funding mechanisms in play to make this happen for the 2035 and 2040 goals. Just a tiny bit more on the other methane for waste, solid waste. Landfills are a huge source of methane emissions in New York State. And so we're proposing that we won't allow organic matter to go into landfills after 2 years from now if it could produce methane. So no food waste, no paper waste, no lumber waste. We're going to do other things with those completely. And agriculture is not a huge source, but it's there, and it's dominated by the burping of methane from cows. And the law prohibits us from actually regulating this as opposed to any of the others, but the agricultural community is working very closely with us, and we have plans to try and reduce that as well. Got one more thing I want to say, and then we can handle questions. I got interested in this question of blue hydrogen because of my role on this commission. And starting 2 years ago, the natural gas industry came to us and said, we know we need to get natural gas out of homes, and the solution is to replace it with blue hydrogen, to which we, in the end, have said, no, it's not. We're not going that route at all. We're going to go with heat pumps, and hopefully high efficiency heat pumps. But it got me interested in blue hydrogen because I hadn't thought about it much. And industry advertises this as a nearly zero emissions fuel of the future. So for those of you who haven't thought about it much, today 96% of hydrogen comes from fossil fuels. In the US, it's virtually all from natural gas. And natural gas is both the feedstock you take methane as the feedstock of the natural gas, you put under high pressure heat, and then add steam, and it disintegrates into hydrogen and CO2. And the natural gas is burned to provide that heat for the heat and pressure. So it uses a hell of a lot of natural gas, and that's called gray hydrogen, and everyone agrees it has high emissions. Blue hydrogen is the thought that you use carbon capture and storage added on to this and make it somehow into a zero emissions fuel. And this was invented by originally in France, the natural gas industry, and more recently throughout Europe and then the US by the natural gas industry, particularly the Hydrogen Council started promoting this in 2018 and 19. And so the group was only set up in 2017, and they represent big oil and gas. BP, Shell, and Total are their originators, and now Exxon's a partner as well. And they're very, very big on promoting blue hydrogen as a replacement for natural gas. So to date, there are only 2 commercial blue hydrogen facilities anywhere. And growing out of my interest in this commission, Mark Jacobson and I took on as a challenge to do a greenhouse gas emissions look at blue hydrogen. We published this paper last August. It's the only peer-reviewed paper out there that has done an adequate job of looking at methane emissions as part of the greenhouse gas footprint. And it's one of the very few papers in the whole area. So just a little tiny bit of detail so you know what we did. There are only 4 input parameters to our analysis, really, 4 or 5. We looked at the amount of carbon dioxide that's captured from the steam methane reforming process, and from the existing data from the plants, we said it's optimistically, when they're doing really well, it's 85%, but we did a sensitivity analysis around that. They haven't tried so far to capture carbon dioxide from the fuel that they burn to power the whole thing, because that's more challenging. But when you look at the literature on that for power plants, 65% is pretty good. Industry claims they can do 90, although they've never demonstrated that. We use 65%. For upstream methane emissions, we use 3.5%, which is my sense of the best estimate for the US and probably globally, maybe conservatively low, if anything. But we did a sensitivity analysis over what I consider a reasonable range, 1.54 to 4.3. And we used a 20-year global warming potential, but we also did a sensitivity analysis for 100-year. And this is what it looks like for our baseline assumptions. On the right, we have natural gas, diesel, and coal, and those are actually the same figures I showed you earlier in this talk. On the left are the hydrogen numbers. So gray hydrogen on the left, which everyone agrees is terrible, but the blue hydrogen, there are two values there. The first one does not try to capture CO2 from the combustion of the gas. The second one does. You still have CO2 emissions, and the more effort you put into capturing CO2, the more natural gas you're using, and therefore the methane emissions go up. So this is, blue hydrogen is not a low emissions or zero emissions fuel at all. It's a little bit better than gray hydrogen, but it's worse than if you simply burned natural gas. And just jumping to the sensitivity analysis, we looked at different levels of methane emissions, and here we're comparing gray hydrogen with the blue hydrogen with or without capturing the CO2 from the combustion of the natural gas. And we compare it with just using natural gas as a fuel itself. So the top one, those are the numbers behind the bars I just showed you. And sure, blue hydrogen is better than gray hydrogen, but not by much. And again, it's worse than natural gas. Methane emissions could be higher, and there's some reason to think that 86 is a low value for a 20-year global warming potential. So this is our sort of worst case scenario. And it's, all the numbers go up, but the take-home message is the same. Blue hydrogen's not much better than gray hydrogen and far worse than natural gas. And our best case scenario is 1.54% methane emissions, which I think is really, really at the low end of what occurs anywhere in the world. And we use a 100-year global warming potential. In this case, all these numbers come down. And sure, blue hydrogen is better than gray hydrogen, but not hugely so. And it's not zero emissions. It's about the same as if you still burn natural gas. We got good press coverage for this as well. It's a nice piece in the New York Times that came out when this was published last summer. And my next to last slide, I just want to say that, up until the time that the oil and gas industry started promoting this just 3 to 4 years ago, this blue hydrogen idea, hydrogen was being thought of just as something you use in hard to decarbonize energy sectors, steel manufacturing, for instance. But the industries have really promoted it for broader uses as a replacement for natural gas for home heating and our pipeline distribution systems and all. In New York, that will be prohibited. Our commission believed our paper, which I'm pleased to say. So we will not allow either production or import of blue hydrogen. And I'm hoping, at least within New York, for green hydrogen, we're just going to use it for the truly hard to decarbonize sectors. So that's my presentation. I just want to acknowledge that we've been working on this for quite a while. I've had nice support both from Cornell University and the Park Foundation. And all of the papers I've talked about, as well as many, many talks, are available at this site down here, howarthlab.org. So thank you for the chance to talk to you.